Now, I'm not that old, allegedly, but I'm old enough to remember the 2008 financial crisis, when the world was sent into a complete tailspin and the global economy looked as though it was on the brink of collapse.
Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement. I don't blame them.
We're now down.
Chaos absolutely everywhere you looked.
Britain's big banks under sustained attack on the markets.
Markets recording absolutely record drops. And since then, the UK has really struggled and has broken record after record, but not in a good way, as in slowest recovery in history, consistently poor economic growth. We're going to be looking at some of the causes, why the UK was hit so hard, and what these two ghouls had to do with it. This is another video in our series about the UK economy. Links for the others will be at the end. But this is where we get into it. I mean, these two clowns will be out of their depth in a puddle, so we're about to do to the UK economy what Limp Bizkit did to music in the 1990s. The first thing is an over-reliance on financial services. London has long held the crown, bit of a wobble recently, but traditionally speaking, it's been the global centre of finance all over the world. One of the reasons why there are more investment banks in London than in New York is because of its location. Banks that are based in London are also able to trade with Asia as well as the US, so you've got that time zone crossover. And for the 80s, 90s and into the early 2000s, this served the UK really well. They brought in high tax receipts, they provided good, high-paying jobs, and were one of the real boons to the City of London. But it was exactly this over-reliance, this overindulgence for big banks, which meant that the UK was disproportionately affected when the financial crisis eventually hit. And with this, it's probably worth saying you should never underestimate the predictability of stupidity, because once the financial institutions had taken hold, they had a really firm grip. And the reason why this is problematic, I suppose, is twofold really. The first is that we had built an economy that was extremely reliant on credit, and so when that credit completely froze, it meant that the rest of the economy froze. And there's an awful lot of people that will say the bank shouldn't have been bailed out. I'm not here to make a moral assessment on that particularly, but every business and every person needs a bank account. If you are making light bulbs, not every business needs to buy a light bulb. If you're making wooden rocking horses or some mad shit like that, not everyone needs that, but everyone needs a bank account. And so when credit markets get frozen, it just sends shockwaves throughout the whole economy. So that's the first thing. So the first point is about credit markets. That was its own problem, but then the other thing then became savings markets. People who had been able to get a reasonable rate of return on their savings were in a position where rates were cut to basically zero, and so this meant that people were not able to get credit, and if they could, it would be in very select circumstances, and it would generally be quite expensive, and people who had money in savings were not getting the rates of returns that they had been used to. The second thing is geographical inequality. As we mentioned, London for a long time was effectively seen as kind of the powerhouse of the rest of the UK. Lord knows it funds a lot of the kind of expensive property that sits in the southeast and all around the home counties in the UK. But what this really meant is that you have this extreme reliance on a particular part of the UK, and so if that freezes up, it trickles down through the rest of the UK geographically. Now this is extremely problematic because you get these places which are hit much more heavily. So historically the way it had worked is that money would flow into London from abroad, and then investors could invest it, let's be honest, a lot of it in London, but also in other parts of the UK. So it meant that there was this potentially double hit effect to some parts of the UK. Low productivity growth. One of the things we talked about in the first video is that UK productivity growth has basically completely flatlined. Now, this is down to all sorts of factors, but when it comes to why that was the case in the run-up and post the financial crisis, and that's basically because lots of companies were trying to reduce their leverage, they were trying to reduce their debt burden, and so that meant they weren't spending money on their productive capacity because there was no demand out there. So they were using money to pay off their debt rather than to invest in new plants, invest in training in your employees, investing in new machinery. And this lower productivity growth ultimately means that the UK became less competitive globally once kind of we could start to see the green shoots of the global economy start to recover. And this lack of productivity growth also meant that wage growth was virtually non-existent for years. And I think this is really important. Over the last 20 years, there have been some really distinct periods of earnings growth, which you can look at kind of in almost a delineated fashion. From 2002 to 2009, it was about 1%. And then between 2014 and 2017, it grew at about 1.5%. So you see this net effect where wages basically go nowhere for kind of a long time. Housing costs. So let's just imagine the scenario. You've bought your house in the mid-early 2000s, but then the arse falls out of the global economy basically because of mortgages. And comment down below if you want a full explainer of how the financial crisis unfolded. But now you're in a situation where your wages aren't growing very much because your company isn't investing, where the price of your house has dropped kind of precipitously, and the interest that you're going to have to pay on your debt increases. So what this really means is that you've got this three-pronged attack on people's disposable income, and very much like the cost of living crisis that we're going through now, it means that people just didn't have money in their pockets to be able to spend on the things that they would want to, and in order to keep the economy moving. And the combination of all three of these factors converging at the same time mean you get this perfect storm of absolutely freezing public consumption, which is a large part of what the economy is based on. Now, people might say, oh, but house prices fell after the financial crisis, so they were more affordable back then. And that's sort of true, but I think the other thing that you have to look at is that people's wages were also getting squeezed a lot. So houses were cheaper, yes, but at a time when people could afford them least. So it's not really a valid analysis in my view. It's kind of smooth brain thinking. I think we should also acknowledge there was a global slowdown as well. Obviously, as I mentioned, the kind of arse completely fell out of the global economy, and virtually every single country was affected, some to a greater degree than others, but it was still a big deal. So this slow process of getting back on your feet economically is not something that's unique to the UK, but it was just more pronounced in the UK. There was a study that showed that it took the UK economy 6 years to recover the lost output from the 2008 financial crisis. So that's a painstakingly slow recovery. Public debt. So the problem here is twofold. The first is that tax receipts started to decrease as a result of businesses not being as profitable, of people not investing as much, people aren't moving house, which affects stamp duty receipts. So the government is effectively taking in less money, but it's also just spent a load of money. You've got millions of people out of work, which means that you've got fewer tax receipts coming in, but you're also paying out benefits to people, rightly so. And you've also just had to spend a load of money bailing out big banks, financial institutions. And so the government's books were kind of completely upside down. And so in 2008, I think the UK deficit, which is the difference between government income and government expenditure in a single year, reached 153 billion, or about 10% of GDP at the time, which was pretty scary stuff. But this is where we get into it. I mean, these two clowns will be out of their depth in a puddle, so let's get into it. And the last thing is poor policy. But there are basically three key players that you have in an economy. You have the government, you have private business, and you have households. And all these three are linked to one another very directly and indirectly. We'll just assume that the economy is somewhat closed for the purposes of this analogy, but obviously in the real world it doesn't quite play out like this. So let's say I go out and buy a car. That car has to be manufactured. All of those components have to be bought around. They are transported through roads that the government has built. I will have to pay VAT on that car, which goes to the government. The government will then use that money to employ so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. And I want to show you this video. This is from a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in 1994 or 1995, I think. And this, for me, just summarises exactly what we're talking about.
There are a lot of ways to try and answer that, but I think the main thing to say is, if you try to have a situation in which everyone is trying to slash at the same time, which the private sector is trying to slash spending because it feels it has too much debt, and in which then the government is also saying, well, we have too much debt, so we're all trying to slash, then we run up against the fundamental fact that we are not a household, we are an economy, and that your spending is my income, and my spending is your income.
As Paul Krugman puts it, my spending is your income, and your spending is my income. And one of the things we've talked about repeatedly on this video is that all three of these big areas in the economy were going through this process of deleveraging. So the Conservative government said that, right, we're borrowing too much money, we've got too much debt, we're going to cut spending in order to reduce our overall indebtedness as a nation. So on the face of it, that seems reasonably sensible. But the problem is, if you're a household, you've got a really big mortgage, maybe you're in negative equity, maybe you've got credit card debt, you're trying to pay that off, you're doing the responsible thing. You've got businesses over here who are also trying to deleverage, and then the government is trying to basically reduce its overall debt burden. And as we know, it didn't go that well. National debt increased. So if these three players are all connected to one another, but the problem is, if everyone's going through this deleveraging process, then where's the growth going to come from? Now, you could make a Keynesian argument here that that's the point at which the government should have done the opposite. They should have turned the tap on big time. Big infrastructure projects, they should have been really funding, build loads of schools, build loads of hospitals, give people loads of jobs, And that's where the growth comes from. And then as the private sector and as private households start to get on a more secure financial footing, you gradually taper off that spending, you gradually increase taxes, and you use that money to reduce your national debt. But the problem was that wasn't the thinking at the time. And I think at this point there's a decent amount of evidence that actually cutting public services and cutting public spending as much as they did at the time basically just meant that it prolonged the kind of economic agony, and the UK economy just didn't recover as quickly as it did. Look at him carrying that thing like he's carrying the Ark of the fucking Covenant. And I think when all is said and done, all right-thinking people would acknowledge that the policy was mistimed and mishandled. So, in conclusion, I think we should separate this out into two pieces. The first is, one of the reasons why the UK was hit so hard was a mistake that was decades in the making. It was deregulation of the financial services industry, it was the over-reliance on the financial services, but then after the financial crisis, there were some shorter-term decisions that were made, like cutting public spending, that just exacerbated it and has really meant that the UK has never really recovered from that. And that's for a few key reasons. So let's just say you cut public transport in a particular city, for example. That means that people are going to struggle to get to a job that they may well be better suited to because it's more difficult to get to. And so you narrow people's economic opportunity and they are not potentially being as productive as they could be. What you really want to do is to facilitate getting the right people into the right jobs. And so you basically kneecap the overall productivity of the economy in the longer term. And so that leads to this, they call it income scarring effect, where the economy just never regains that bit that it lost from the financial crisis. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to watch the previous videos in this series where we talked about the weakness of the UK economy and some of the policy objectives which could really help to alleviate some of these problems that we've talked about, then make sure you check out these videos just here. Thanks very much for watching. Peace.